This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's all you need to know about me in that one sentence. The podcast, though, well, we're here, as the title suggests, to talk of the stories of films, those coincidences, the behind-the-scenes stories, the development stories, marketing stories, those tales that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to pick for the podcast, if you're here for the first time, welcome. If you're not, welcome anyway. They tend to have a mainstream leaning. They tend to be films that I have some degree of investment or interest in. I don't do snark, so if you're looking for that, this isn't the podcast for you. But if you're still here and I've not put you off, that's enough waffle and preamble from me. I'm going to play you a clip from the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, and I'll pick up the story the other side of this.
What is this?
It's someplace new.
Jack, look out!
Whoa!
What's this? What's this? There's color everywhere. What's this? There's white things in the air. What's this? I can't believe my eyes. I must be dreaming. Wake up, Jack. This isn't fair.
What is this?
Haven't you heard of peace on earth and goodwill toward men?
And that was a clip from 1993's Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas, although as anyone who's ever done a movie pub quiz will know, it wasn't directed by Tim Burton. Instead, it was directed by Henry Selick. The story and the characters came from the mind of Burton, who also produced. Michael McDowell's credited with the adaptation, Caroline Thompson with the screenplay. The voice cast of this one includes the likes of Danny Elfman, Chris Sarandon, Catherine O'Hara, William Hickey, Paul Rubens in there as well, Greg Proops too. Quite a big, extensive voice ensemble for a film that was really, I mean, it's hard to really contextualise this now, but it was just so far out of its time when it arrived. But the genesis of the film that became The Nightmare Before Christmas started inevitably with Tim Burton, but long before he hit the big time with films such as Pee Wee Herman, Beetlejuice and Batman in the 80s. In fact, he'd say really the first idea for it sprung, 20 years before you saw it on the big screen, so that's what, the early 70s, and it goes back to Burton's childhood. He came up with the original inspiration from the Christmas decorations that would go up around his California home. He grew up in California, and he said in several interviews that growing up in California, the weather was pretty much the same, constant right throughout the year, never really dramatically changed that much. So when decorations went up for assorted holiday seasons, that had a bigger impact on Burton than perhaps if you lived in the joys of the West Midlands, where I do, where the weather's all over the shop. That notwithstanding, there was a period, and it's a conundrum that continues to baffle people as to when to exactly programme The Nightmare Before Christmas, where Halloween decorations would be in stores, and the shops would also start stocking Christmas stuff, and you'd have these two seasons overlapping in the retail stores of California at the time. Burton kind of put that together. That's where he picked up the idea. Now, it's pretty well known that Burton then pursued a career at Disney as a Disney animator. He worked on the likes of The Fox and the Hound. He was there when John Lasseter was in his infancy at the studio. And he was also at a point where he was making his short films, most notably Vincent, using the voice of his hero Vincent Price, of course. And Burton, of course, also was heavily influenced and heavily in love with the stop frame, stop motion form of animation, the sheer physicality of it, heroes such as Ray Harryhausen, and basically the long way round of animation, at a point where studios just weren't making films of that ilk anymore. That while he was at Disney, he was making hand-drawn. As he moved into the 90s, obviously the shift would be towards CG animation. But at that point, he was making his short film Vincent. He would go on to do the short version of Frankenweenie not long after that as well. And this was stop frame work. And it kind of all interspersed when in the early 80s he'd written a poem of The Nightmare Before Christmas that introduced the characters of Jack Skellington and his dog Zero, and he kind of got the idea of perhaps developing it a little bit more, that he'd put Vincent together. He was starting to be able to make his own films, and he had this idea that he wanted to develop. But at the point where he really decided to push ahead with it, what Burton was looking to do was pitch The Nightmare Before Christmas as a Christmas special, that he didn't see it as a piece of cinema. His original thought of it was that this would be one of the more skewed television specials that appeared on a seasonal basis, obviously around Christmas. So he pitched the project to television studios in the first instance to see if they'd bite, to see if there's any interest. There was none. Nobody was really looking for it, and so he still wanted to tell this story. He got these characters in his head. He had the idea in his head of roughly what he wanted to do. So he tried to position it as a book, and so he put together a pitch, and that was sent off to an assortment of publishers, as I understand it. And again, it wasn't to be. They turned it down, and it was only when Burton ultimately pitched it as a film that, given his growing stature in the industry, people would finally wake up to the idea. Now, there was a slight problem with this one, because Burton had actually developed the idea for The Nightmare Before Christmas while he was working at Disney, and as a consequence of that, Disney technically owned its work. By the sounds of it, the studio at the time didn't know it didn't really know what was on its asset book in terms of this particular project. But when it suddenly started to bubble up and Disney realised that it basically had first call on the rights to make this film, it pretty much snapped Burton's arm off to make it. Now, Burton in the late 80s, early 90s, of course, was a far different proposition to a movie studio than Burton in the early 80s, because 1989 he directed Batman, which was the biggest blockbuster of its particular era. But before that, I mean, you look at what he did with Pee Wee Herman, you look at what he did with Beetlejuice, and those were breakout hits on a fairly small budget that managed to marry up both acclaim and box office. So studios really wanted to work with Tim Burton. So Edward Scissorhands was moving into development as well, which Fox would ultimately release in the early 90s. But when it came time for The Night Before Christmas, and it finally looked as though Disney was going to press ahead and do this project, the problem was Burton, who had long wanted to make this film, didn't have the time to direct the film, because at this stage, and so we're coming now to the very, very early 90s, Burton was committed to making Batman Returns for Warner Brothers. Now, the original Batman movie had been made in London. I've covered Batman Returns on an earlier episode of the Film Stories podcast, but one of the things with Batman Returns was Burton wanted that production to be located in Los Angeles, close to his home, which it duly was. Even so, at that stage, it was going to be impossible for Burton to direct the film. I mean, it's worth noting that in the mid-2000s he directed and was credited as director on Corpse Bride, when he was also working on, I believe it was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, his take on that story at the same time. But at this stage, no studio had made a full-length stop-motion animated feature, and it clearly needed more attention, and it needed facilities setting up, really, to be able to do this. Thus, with Burton also, I mean, but the production on this one went on so long that by the end of production, not only had Burton made and released Batman Returns, but he was in pre-production on Ed Wood, which would be his film afterwards. He turned to an old friend of his. He turned to the brilliant Henry Selick, who would go on and direct Coraline, which is terrific. And he knew Selick from his days at Disney Animation. And he would also, when it came time, so Selick would take on the director's mantle of The Nightmare Before Christmas. And Burton would also turn to a frequent collaborator of his, Danny Elfman, who had done the music for all of his films to that point. Now, this was pivotal, really, in the creation of the film, because at the point Elfman started coming up with the really iconic songs from the film, the script wasn't in place, filming hadn't begun. What would happen is reportedly Burton would send sketches to Elfman with a few bits of plot just threaded on them. Elfman would come up with the songs off the back of them, and they'd work them from that point. It would ultimately be Caroline Thompson who would shepherd Burton's drawings and plot strands into the final script. Although, as we're about to discover, the script took some time to come together. But Elfman sang all the songs as he composed them, and ultimately he would retain the singing role of Jack Skellington in the final movie. Although he doesn't do the spoken word. Those words are spoken, the character of Jack Skellington, by Chris Sarandon, who singing wasn't his strength, but it was discovered that the singing voice of Elfman and the spoken voice of Sarandon married up quite well. Thus, they effectively shared the role. Now, going back to that point, that there hadn't been a stop motion movie made by an American studio in so long at that point, we're talking decades, really, for a full length, purely animated film of this ilk. And so what was happening, that Disney was willing to back the film. However, the whole thing had to be set up from scratch. Disney didn't have those facilities. I mean, to a degree, it reminds me of when Disney decided to go back into hand-drawn with The Princess and the Frog, and they had to dig out all the equipment that they'd mothballed and been ordered to throw out just years before. In the case of The Nightmare Before Christmas, that equipment really wasn't in existence, even though it's a fairly primary form, and I mean that in the most complimentary way, of animation. There was the mechanics of what they were looking to do were deeply complex, and so Selick got thinking, and what he decided to do was to set up the animation studio in San Francisco to do the work. Now, this was a deliberate geographic decision. It wasn't purely Selick's, but it was a deliberate geographic decision because it would be away from Los Angeles and Disney, for one. Thus, they kind of reconciled. They wanted to make this film away from the glare of the studio, because the film goes into dark places. That's pretty known now. But this was going through the Disney machine, and at this point, it was intended to be a release with the Disney logo on. I will come back to that a bit later. The other advantage to setting up in San Francisco, though, is that's relatively close. Well, that's where Lucasfilm and George Lucas's operations were based, and as such, there was a rich seam of animation talent that they could tap in that area. And in the end, it was a 40,000 square foot space that was used, an old studio basically brought back to life. And Selick got to make large chunks of the film with neither Disney nor, as it happened, Tim Burton in close proximity. And Selick did say, because there's always been contention over who directed the film, even though there shouldn't be, and Burton's always been very clear that Henry Selick directed the film. Burton wanted to, but Selick did say, I don't want to take away from Tim. He was not in San Francisco when we made it. He came up 5 times over 2 years, spent no more than 8 or 10 days in total actually on the set where they were making the film. As it would happen, Walt Disney's feature animation department would help with some traditional animation work, but Burton was juggling these 2 big live action projects, Batman Returns and Ed Wood. That said, it was clearly Burton's idea. It was clearly Burton's design. I mean, there have been extensive publications that have just demonstrated the wealth of Burton's visual brilliance that underpins The Nightmare Before Christmas, and the sets were being built to reflect and capture just what Burton wanted, that original vision really that he wanted to put on the screen. Technology had to be involved and invented to do large chunks of the film. One of the most taxing shots in the movie apparently is just a simple shot of a door opening, and that proved a massive challenge. And whilst now it's pretty well known that stop frame animation studios have several sets on the go at the same time, that it's such a painstaking form of animation where the amount of footage produced every week is very much on the limited side. Here, the idea of 20 individual sets being built at that peak within that facility. Well, this was something new for Disney. Now, when the actual animation work began in July 1991, by that point, of course, all the visual designs had the bulk of the visual designs had been completed. The sets had to be built. The characters had to be built. So even though the animation phase was, 2 years, just under 2 years, there was already exhaustive work just to get to the point where animators could go to their sets and just start capturing those individual frames that would go to make the movie. And the film did start with a skeleton crew. The finished script wasn't in place. It did evolve over the course of the production. And it would be ultimately 3 years from start to finish to get the film made, with the animation obviously taking up the bulk of the back end of that schedule. But that skeleton crew at first was about 15 people, and over the course of the production it would rise to around 120. And the first big sequence they tackled was the excellent What's This song, which takes place relatively early in the film, where Jack Skellington discovers Christmas Land for the first time. I'm not getting particularly heavy on the plot, just to say, if you've not seen the film, it really is a delight, and it'll only takes you less than 80 minutes of your time to watch the film, and then you just want to watch it again. The work was, as you would expect, painstaking, absolutely painstaking. That they were working to around a minute of animated footage a week. And Burton, even though he wasn't on set, he was in his own way present, that he would get a package of this footage through roughly every week to go through and review it and send his notes and make. But again, it was ultimately Henry Selick that was directing the film. In all, over 100,000 individual photographs, individual frames were shot for The Nightmare Before Christmas. They built and used about 225 individual puppets. Those puppets, they burned through hundreds of heads just to get the expressions, the range of expressions they needed from the characters in the movie. And this exhaustive effort began to shape and began to form the completed film. There was just a bit of voice casting I just do want to touch on, because again, going back to the fact that Vincent Price was a huge hero to Tim Burton, and Burton would cast Price again later in his career. He was originally due to be the voice of Santa in the film, or Sandy Claus if you like, but Price's wife sadly passed away in 1991, and so apparently he did record a little bit of work, but there was just so much sadness in his voice. It's a really sombre, downbeat tale, and ultimately it was decided to go in a different direction for the voice of Santa in the movie. Also, to give you an idea again of just some of the flux of it, Patrick Stewart, if you've bought the soundtrack CD, I suppose it's a download now, kids, but if you bought that, Patrick Stewart's narration is on the soundtrack album, but it's not in the film, because even though Stewart was intended to narrate chunks of the film and his voice was due to appear several times throughout the movie, after he'd recorded his work on it, the decision was made to give those lines to Santa, that the narration in the movie was cut right back. Now, there were problems within Disney about just what to do with this movie, because the Disney of the early 90s is very different to the Disney of now. That Disney films were traditionally U certificate, they were playing to a very broad family audience, and the Disney brand name, if you like, was firmly cemented as a family brand, that you put the word Disney out there, the families knew what they were getting. Things have evolved significantly since that point. But David Hoberman, who was then the president of Disney's Touchstone Pictures division, told the Los Angeles Times in an interview around the time of the film's release that he was unsure about exactly who the film's audience will be. And he says, quote, "I'm hoping and I think we're going after that sort of 15 to 25 age group, and then also a more sophisticated kind of upscale group." And then he says, "But I think it'll go down well below that, frankly. We've had screenings for everybody, and at a certain point, age 4, 5 and 6, some kids have been scared, and yet some of them have loved it, and it's kind of been difficult to ascertain which way to go." And this, I mean, can you imagine Disney saying this out in the press now? I mean, very, very different times. But Disney was really cautious about what to do with it, because there was pushback. Even though the film was remotely being made some distance away from Disney's headquarters, there were real concerns, for instance, over the fact that the character of Jack Skellington doesn't have eyes, that one of the absolute fundamentals of animated films was your characters have eyes, you relate through the eyes, you emote through the eyes, and here, in the midst of this wildly ambitious and very left field film, the central character had no eyes, and Disney pushed the filmmakers. We want him to have eyes, and it was the combined force really of Burton and Henry Selick just pushing back and saying no, and ultimately they got their way. But as I understand it, there was a degree of let's just go debate over just which way to go. There was debate too over how on earth do you release this film? How does Disney, the way it was set up at the time, put The Nightmare Before Christmas out into the world? So it had ultimately a film that was complete. It's worth just finalising those story credits on there, because there was just been some subsequent conversation about that. That originally, when Burton was looking to develop the film, it was Michael McDowell, who he'd worked with on Beetlejuice, who he wanted to develop it with, and they had a parting of the ways over the project, which is what led Burton to Elfman, which I talked about just before. Caroline Thompson's gets the screenplay credit, although Henry Selick would argue that most of the dialogue came from someone else, because she too found her schedule was just filling up with other projects, and that while the animators were putting the film together, they were having to rework and rework dialogue and rework elements of the movie. Nonetheless, all of these credits finally locked down and were in place. Disney had the film and had to decide what to do with it, and ultimately it kind of argued that the film was too dark for children. They couldn't put this out, and so what they did, and they did this with Who Framed Roger Rabbit as well, is they put it out under the Touchstone Pictures label. And I've talked about Touchstone a few times on Assorted Film Stories podcast, films like Three Men and a Baby, we talked about it with Turner and Hooch, but as Henry Selick would tell IGN, looking back at the film some 10-15 years later, their biggest fear, and why it was kind of a stepchild project, was they're afraid of their core audience hating the film and not coming. But when in fact once kids found out about it, it connected with them as well as Tim Burton's regular fan base. But the expectations at Disney were that this might put people off Disney. It was Disney too, it should know, that pushed for the film to be called Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas rather than just The Nightmare Before Christmas. A fairly obvious branding exercise on its part, rather than necessarily trying to cement whose authorship the film was. That Burton's stock at the box office clearly was relatively prominent at this point, and the idea of putting an animated Tim Burton vision out into the film and putting that above the title, that was something the Disney marketing department could sell, and it was struggling really to find different ways that it could sell the movie in the first place. Now the film would ultimately therefore premiere at the New York Film Festival in October 1993, and I mean there remains the debate about when really to watch the film. Is it a Halloween film? Is it a Christmas film? Burton's always tended to lean more towards Christmas film, but the point was this $18 million production, which had been exhaustive to put together, absolutely exhausting, that it had required the setting up of this new facility to do it. It had required them to have to learn new techniques. It had required them to have to come up with the assorted technology to do the intricate animation for the puppets in certain cases. There's a lot of electronic work going on under the surface as well as the aforementioned traditional animation. But they got it done, and the film, when it arrived ultimately in cinemas, which was a few weeks later, it came out for a wide theatrical release in the US on October the 29th, 1993. Well, the reception to it was it was positive. Critics were, on the whole, effusive in their praise of the movie, and to the surprise, really, of outsiders, it became something of a box office hit as well. Now, not a huge one, but it made over $50 million in the US when it first arrived in cinemas, and considering what the expectations for the film were, and really the fact that it was such a step into the unknown, that was a result. Furthermore, after its original release in mid-October was limited in just a few cinemas around the US. So when it did expand wide at the end of October 1993, the film actually got to number 1 at the US box office. It displaced the Beverly Hillbillies, knocked Demolition Man down the chart, knocked Cool Runnings into 4th place. Though for us in the UK, we had to wait a year. This was the era where you could leave it a year and there wouldn't be a DVD release or anything to worry about. So at the point the movie was getting released on video in the US a year later, we were finally getting it in the UK. Now, ordinarily when a movie grosses, 50 million at the box office, that tends to be it. But The Nightmare Before Christmas has grown and grown and grown since that original release, and you only have to look at the continuing breadth of memorabilia and collectibles around Nightmare Before Christmas. The fact that Jack Skellington is a staple at Disneyland theme parks around the world, come every Halloween, come every Christmas, and the fact that the film just keeps on selling on all the assorted formats that Disney will happily provide it for you on. The movie also got a 3D re-release, it should be noted, and even as I record this, there are concerts taking place that are set to take place at the Royal Albert Hall in London, full, sold out concerts playing the soundtrack to the film alongside the movie projected on a big screen, and it's attracting huge audiences. Disney ultimately really woke up to this, and not just in the way that it's harvested the collectible angle on it, and there's some beautiful stuff out there, but also there was a point in 2001 where the studio was looking at doing a sequel to the movie, and this was the era where Disney was doing all of those much loved direct to DVD sequels to its animated films. I mean, who doesn't love a bit of Pocahontas 2? And so that was at the point, therefore, where Disney suggested, well, how about doing a CG sequel to The Nightmare Before Christmas? And thankfully, this was a project that Tim Burton had the power to shut down and just say no to. And he told MTV around the time that the idea of, he said, I was always very protective of Nightmare not to do sequels or things of that kind, because he says, Jack Visits Thanksgiving World or other kinds of things, just because I felt the movie had a purity to it and the people like it. Because it's not a mass market kind of thing, it was important to keep that purity to it. I tried to respect people and keep the purity of the project as much as possible. As such, The Nightmare Before Christmas remains a one-off, although Burton would go off and do a couple of other stop-frame animated feature-length movies, The Corpse Bride, and then he would make a full-length version of Frankenweenie, and I really love his full-length version of Frankenweenie. But Henry Selick, it should be noted, will go off and do James the Giant Peach, that Burton also had a light involvement with before going off to do Coraline. The Nightmare Before Christmas, though, is really something special, and whether you watch it at Halloween, whether you watch it at Christmas, or whether you cunningly position a podcast to land at the end of November, early December, just to try and hedge your bets, it's a film well worth digging out. And that brings us to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. If you like this podcast, it helps me enormously if you subscribe to it, if you leave, hopefully, a positive review of it as well. I am an independent publisher. Every bit of word of mouth I get is just gold dust, because I can't afford any other publicity. Same goes for my magazines as well. Film Stories and Film Stories Junior magazines are available to order at www.filmstories.co.uk. We're a bit old-fashioned with those magazines. Rather than spend all the money that we have for them, like there's much, rather than spend the money that we have for them on marketing and promotion, we actually pay writers so that writers don't have to write for exposure, because I don't like that sort of thing. I think you get some good magazines for your money. You also support us giving breaks and opportunities to writers and filmmakers. You can find out more about that www.filmstories.co.uk. And because I've waffled on again a bit too much, I'm going to dive straight into the clip for the second of the two movies I want to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. Here we go.
I got this feeling. It's a weird feeling. The cabin starts to shake, right? And the left side blows up, and then the whole plane just explodes. The plane's gonna explode! It's not a joke! It's not a joke!
We get thrown off the plane all because Brownie has a bad dream?
I saw it.
The plane! It's gonna blow up! It's gonna blow up!
All 287.
Right then, we find ourselves in the year 2000 now for the very first of the Final Destination films. This one directed by James Wong. The screenplay credited to Jeffrey Reddick, James Wong and Glenn Morgan from A Story by Reddick. The cast: Devon Sawa, Ali Larter, Kerr Smith, Kirsten Cloak, Sean William Scott in there as well, and the deep, deep voice of Tony Todd. The movie, though, well, it started with the aforementioned Jeffrey Reddick, that he, at the time, was working at New Line Cinema. And the way that he got to New Line Cinema in the first place is a story in itself. I will come to I'll come to that in a second. But he was, at that point, the assistant to the co-chairman of Worldwide Marketing, as I gather it. But he wanted to get into writing. He wanted to get an agent for his writing work, and so he hatched a plan. At the time, the X-Files TV series was very much at its peak and hugely popular, and he decided he was going to put together a spec script for the X-Files with a view to sending that off to an agent and getting himself some representation, so then he'd be able to sell his idea, and then he'd be able to push his writing career from that point. So separately, he was on a flight at one point, and he read a story while he was on that flight about a woman who was on holiday in Hawaii, who got a phone call from her mum the day before she was due to come home, telling her not to take the flight home the following day. She's had some kind of premonition. And so the woman took her mum's advice and changed planes, and the original flight she was due to fly on was in an accident. And Reddick was really taken with this, the whole idea of what would happen if she was supposed to have died on that flight. And he fashioned his story from that point. Does death have some kind of flight plan? Now, he was already through the door at New Line, and so it had taken quite a journey for him to get to that point. Reddick grew up as a horror movie nut, and a self-confessed one. And he said that he was 14 years old, living in Kentucky. He didn't know how the film industry worked. He didn't have any idea of how screenwriting worked. He didn't really know what he was doing. But he wrote a 10-page sequel to A Nightmare on Elm Street, which at that time was New Line Cinema's biggest property. And he sent that outline to Robert Shea, who at the time was New Line Cinema's chairman. And Shea, he got the standard reply back when you sent a script off to a studio, which is we don't accept any unsolicited material. And so, not knowing the rules of the game really, and not knowing that studios didn't respond to writers who didn't have the representation of agents, Reddick just didn't take no for an answer. And so he wrote back to Bob Shea. I really love this, and it was he said it was a surly note listing all of the New Line Cinema movies that I had seen and the amount of money I'd spent watching them. And Reddick said that since I'd spent all that time and money on his product, he could take 5 minutes to look over my story. And Shea replied. He replied with what was described as, quote, a very nice and encouraging note, unquote. And he liked the he did indeed read the story and commended Reddick on the imagination that went into it, suggested he work on structure, and apparently Reddick still had that letter. And so he went away and he wrote more and more and more, and he kept in contact with the studio through all of that time. And he ultimately secured an internship at New Line Cinema, which is how he got through the door. And so New Line was sent, obviously off the back of Nightmare on Elm Street, lots and lots of ideas for horror movies, and also the Scream movie in 1996 had caused something of an avalanche for teen horror movies in Hollywood, and New Line was positioned well to take advantage of that. And so he put together this story that he had in his head, that at that point it was called Flight 180, and he didn't ultimately submit it to the X-Files. That he was talking to people within New Line about it, but the story did indeed land him an agent, and his agent said you should develop this as a feature film, which is what Reddick did. Now, Craig Perry was a producer who saw the treatment that was penned for the movie, and it was Perry really who saw something in it. And as Perry would say to Bloody Disgusting website when it did a look back on the Final Destination films a few years ago, he realised it kind of hit what New Line was looking for. It was just a bit different. I mean, it was going to be low budget, it was going to be horror edge, but it was a bit different and there was something to it. And so there was still the fact that Jeffrey Reddick was a novice screenwriter, but with Perry's help, that he helped fashion it into something a bit more substantive. And the story changed, and so the story went through several incarnations as they developed it. So one of the differences was in the original scripts that were put together, all of the characters who get off the plane at the start of Final Destination have no connection at the start, and they ended up seeking each other after the accident. And so instead they changed that. They wanted them to be connected before they got on the plane. They wanted everyone to sort of know each other at the start, which is how it became a high school trip, as basically the mechanic to bring everyone together onto the flight in the first place. And that of course changes it as well. Then it becomes a sort of high school horror-ish kind of thing, but it was still very, very steeped in horror and Reddick's love of horror as well. You just have to look at the likes of some of the character names in the films and how they link to old horror movie directors. Now, once they got to the point where the script was in a place to move forward, New Line was keen, and it turned in fact, it would turn to the X-Files, ironically, given that was ultimately where the project was originally going to be pitched to, and it turned to Glenn Morgan and James Wong, who were writers on the X-Files, with a view to Morgan being one of the producers of Flight 180, and Wong making his feature directorial debut on it. But one of the things New Line did for the pair is they gave them a little bit of leeway to come up with their own take on the project, that there was still some wiggle room here to develop it. And so it was they really who centred on the fascination with life and death and the workings of fate. And what Wong also argued was, quote, "We want to do for planes and air travel what Jaws did for sharks and swimming." Also, it's worth noting that Wong was also adamant that he didn't want to make a slasher movie, that lots and lots of those were coming up in the aftermath of Scream, that he wanted smart. If his film was going to be about teenagers, he wanted smart teenagers. He didn't want cannon fodder, really, just paper-thin characters who would just go through the shredder. Now, when it came to casting the movie, well, Devon Sawa was pretty much an unknown. He actually read the script for the first time on a plane. Tobey Maguire was actually on the wish list for his role, but it was Sawa who ultimately prevailed. That Tony Todd's deep voice, I mean, he'd sprung to fame off Candyman, of course, but it was his deep voice that helped him land a role in that. And then a fairly young and not massively high profile cast was gathered together. It's worth noting Kerr Smith was making Dawson's Creek around the same time, and that actually to a degree hit the schedule for Final Destination, that a lot of the cast were working on other bits and bobs at the time. So Devon Sawa was making something called The Guilty at the time, Smith was making Dawson's Creek, and the schedule of Final Destination, as a consequence, just had to work around the commitments of the assorted people who were involved with it. Filming on the movie would begin, and it shot primarily, well, it shot in Canada, but it would begin at the end of May 1999. It would go through to mid-August of 1999, and for a long time it was called Flight 180. In fact, the change to the name Final Destination didn't come until pretty much the last minute, and the problem was that if it's Flight 180, are people just going to confuse it with the likes of the airport films? And so ultimately, even though the creators quite liked the idea of Flight 180, it was New Line that pushed for the new title, and they in fact in post-production reshot some of the tags on the bags to add the word Final Destination to them. That wasn't in the original block of shooting on the film. There were some nonetheless very significant challenges for a film that was only costing about 20 million-ish to make, and by far the biggest really was one of the things that what Wong wanted to do was to put you on the plane when it's not a spoiler, I don't think, to suggest that at the start of Final Destination a plane explodes, and they wanted to put you in the midst of that. And so what they did is they built a full-scale mock-up of a 747 jet. They put it on a big hydraulic gimbal, and it took 2 months basically to put together that central that central set, it had to be able to hold 89 people in the end, ultimately, and it had to be able to be used for the onboard sequences. They had to be able to shift it from 45 to 60 degrees, and they had to really try and put across the idea of airborne engine failure on a plane. Now, that bit was done practically, but there's also some quite savvy CG work that was done in the movie. So the departure boards in the airport, they're all CG effects. The planes outside of the airport window are models, if you look quite closely. I mean, the director's commentary on this, in fact, it's broader. There's quite a few people on the commentary track. They point out all sorts of little details like that. It's well worth having a listen to. But if you look at the model plane, apparently I did see it in the background. It's clearly a model, and they couldn't even afford having any kind of animation for the pilot seat, so there's basically no one sitting in it. As you'd expect on a film of this ilk, lots of the decisions were made because of the circumstances that, to a degree, they were presented with. So even though they were looking to do some filming at Vancouver Airport, there were things they needed to do. They needed to blow out the windows, for instance, and they just found the cheaper way to do that is to go elsewhere and build a set for moments such as that. The primarily young cast gelled in the midst of it all. I think Sean William Scott, I forgot to mention before, the American Pie films hadn't spiked at this point. At the point this was being shot, they were just, the first one was just about to. He was improvising quite a lot on the set. But look at those sets, because there's some really interesting production design work they deliberately put in place. Now, the production designer is a man called John Willett, and what they wanted to do was to create, quote, an intriguing visual signature, unquote, for the film. And what they wanted to do with that was, again, quote, to serve the subtleties of the script and to help personify death. And so they skewed the sets. And what they tried to do is they had pretty much two versions of every set was designed. One for scenes before the jet blows up and one after. And after the incident, they play with things. They skew perspective a little bit. They skew colour a little bit. Nothing really is parallel. And there's all sorts of little details in the midst of it all that are just designed to make the sets feel a little unnatural after the explosion takes place, to give the viewer the feeling that something isn't really quite there, that something's not quite right. It was a huge challenge to put all of this together, but by March 2000 the film was ready for its release. And I remember when this film was being promoted in the UK that it was, in my head, the first film I remember seeing where the television spots were of audience reactions to the movie, that they played up the point in the UK. I'm not sure if this was reflected in the US, of audiences jumping out of their seat. And this was, that's quite interesting, I think, given that they were trying to do something a little away from the kind of screen model of stuff that was around at the time. The film launched, though, in the US, distributed by New Line. It was distributed by Entertainment in the UK, so it may have been different ways of approaching it. But in the US, it opened on March the 17th. It opened at on the same weekend as Erin Brockovich, the week before Mission to Mars. And Lord, there's a film that's got a lot of stories to it. The weekend after Mission to Mars, which had opened at number 1. But Final Destination opened to okayish reviews. I mean, critics were never going to be bowled over by what many perceived as a teen horror, although I think there's more to it than that. But it opened at number 3. It opened with 10 million at the box office, and it stuck it out. Its second weekend, it stayed at number 3. I mean, Romeo Must Die opened just above it the second weekend, but it held, about 75%, just shy of that first weekend audience. And in fact, Final Destination would hang around the charts for a little while. It stayed in the top 10 in the US for several weeks, and ultimately it would be on its way to picking up over $50 million at the US box office, and around, I think it was around 113 million worldwide. The final budget that was reported around the 23 million mark. And notably, when the film was released, Reddit, remember him right at the start, was apparently still the assistant to the co-chairman of worldwide marketing. New Line was ahead of the game really in terms of sequelizing. Is that a word? Let's say making sequels to horror films. I mean, just look at the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and it was interested in the idea of a Final Destination 2, and it reapproached the key creatives to come back for the film. James Wong, though, was unable to do that. He was set to make The One, I think it was at that time, and so into the director's chair stepped David R. Ellis, who was the late David R. Ellis, who was the second unit director and stunt coordinator on the first Final Destination, and it would be he who got to direct what I would argue is the finest of the Final Destination films, Final Destination 2. Now, Wong would come back to direct Final Destination 3, Ellis would be back for Final Destination 4, and there was a fifth film as well. That fifth film came out in 2011, directed by Stephen Quayle. It was called Final Destination 5, notably following the fourth film that was called The Final Destination, so clearly it wasn't. But after the fifth film, that one kind of underperformed on expectations, although still profitable. But at the start of 2019, we learnt that New Line, perhaps unsurprisingly, was pressing ahead with a reboot of the series. It hired Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, who were behind Saw movies, to come up with a script for a new Final Destination film. That Final Destination 6 won't actually be Final Destination 6 because the plan is to do a complete reboot and pretty much start from scratch on it. But to this point, that franchise that was ultimately came out of someone trying to get an agent by writing an X-Files episode has pulled together over $600 million worth of business at the box office alone, as well as the assorted DVD and soundtrack and all the other gubbins that goes to make films lots and lots of money. Whether any of the original creatives or cast will come back for the next film whenever it happens, that much is unclear. But whether they do or not, there's a pretty impressive box set with a fair amount of fun in it already out there, waiting to be discovered if you've not checked the movies out before. Which all brings me to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We have a website with daily updated news, apart from weekends. Everyone needs sleep. News, features, reviews. You can find that at www.filmstories.co.uk. We have a growing YouTube channel of exclusive interviews and video film stories. You can find that at youtube.com/filmstories. We're on Facebook as well, facebook.com/filmstoriesonline. But for now, I thank you as always for listening. I thank you for your support. I'll be back again soon with another bunch of film stories. You all take care. Bye-bye.